You've got a great idea for a small business, but you just can't get it off the ground. You want to be your own boss, set your own hours. Well, new year means new opportunities, and Shopify's got you covered to help get your venture off the ground. Shopify makes it easy to manage your growing business. You can get your store up and running easily with thousands of customizable templates. And they help with the details like shipping, taxes, and payments from one single dashboard. Don't kick yourself next holiday season when your 2025 resolution list looks the same as it does today. Make it happen with Shopify. Established in 2025 has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to start selling with Shopify today. Shopify.com/income.
Hey there, Ryan Reynolds here. It's a new year, and you know what that means. No, not the diet. Resolutions. A way for us all to try and do a little bit better than we did last year. And my resolution, unlike big wireless, is to not be a raging and raise the price of wireless on you every chance I get. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited. See mintmobile.com for details.
This content may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion advised.
I turned and looked back down at the peninsula, and what I saw left my mind in shambles.
I literally thought I was going insane or that I was dreaming. It was so surreal.
The most shocking part was what they found in that little basement room.
I couldn't quite shake my fear. For weeks, every time I came home after dark, I found myself bracing as I got close to my door.
From killer podcasts, true tales of horror, bizarre happenings, unexplainable events. This is Disturbed. Hello, and welcome back to the show. This week, we're bringing you 5 stories that will give you a sickening feeling in your stomach. So sit back, listen closely, and dive into the horror. First, Please Help Me is the title of our story from r/paranormal, narrated by the talented Gregory James.
The following is a true account of my experience attempting an all-night hike. I can only hope that somebody, somewhere, may have the experience or knowledge to explain the events that I am about to describe. Recently, I went to a state park a while north of me to attempt an all-night solo hiking adventure. I thought it would be fun and maybe a little scary, but only scary enough to make a good story, you know? The most I was prepared for was fighting coyotes over my food, but I was very wrong. I got to East Fork State Park in Batavia around 7 p.m. Given the time of year, it was already dark. I picked a nice spot near the lake and started preparing my food. I placed a T-bone steak on my propane grill and began cooking it. I turned around to rummage through my pack for a second flashlight, and my hands stumbled across something cold and hard. I picked it up, and to my utter confusion, it was the steak. I looked down to see my propane grill running with nothing on it. I was immediately put off by this. I had no explanation for it. I have no known mental health conditions that could account for this. Attempting to regain my comfort, I took the steak and once again placed it on the grill. I stared at it, watched it sizzle. I waited till I could smell the steam before I took my eyes off of it. I then continued looking for my flashlight. all was well for a few hours. After finishing my dinner, I hiked for about a mile. I was moving quite slowly compared to my usual pace. The steak thing was still on my mind, but I decided it was nothing to worry about. I was coming around a bend where the trees began to get denser when I saw a buck standing 20 yards ahead, facing me on the trail. I reached for my phone to take a picture. I wanted to wait for the deer to turn its head before taking the photo, but it just stood there, making eye contact with me for a solid 45 seconds. Finally, I gave up and took the photo, then resumed walking. As I got closer to the deer, I expected it to dart into the trees, but it remained unfazed. Baffled, I took my phone out once again and began recording. I approached the deer slowly and was able to get within 10 feet of it before I heard it exhale and it hopped off. I was extremely surprised by this behavior, but wasn't really fazed. I continued hiking, and by this point, I'd stopped thinking about that steak. For about another hour, I was granted a peaceful hike until the path came to a bald spot in the trees. I was hit with the incredibly pungent stench of burning hair and rotting flesh. The smell was so powerful that I immediately began vomiting. This wasn't strange. I'm typically very sensitive to smells, and my stomach is easily upset. What was not normal was that I kept vomiting. I couldn't stop. I lost every single thing I'd eaten. I heaved about 5 times, then dry heaved another 3. By this point, I was laying on the ground, crying in excruciating pain. My vision was clouded by tears, but between my forceful blinks, I could see my hands illuminated in a soft red glow. When I finally stopped heaving, I looked up and saw light over the trees with no source, almost as if someone was holding a really bright flashlight yards away. I had no idea what was going on, but I assumed I was extremely ill. Between the hallucinations and vomiting, I was convinced I was poisoned or ate something I should not have at some point. The way back started off normal, and other than my horrible stomach ache, I was fine. However, upon crossing the base of the peninsula that I'd cooked on, my flashlight was jerked out of my hand. I turned around, thinking the lanyard had caught on a branch, but there were no branches within reach. The back of my throat got that odd feeling I remember getting as a child waking up from a bad dream. Fearful as I was, I continued up that steep hill, using my phone's flashlight instead. Once I reached the top, I turned and looked back down at the peninsula, and what I saw left my mind in shambles. I saw myself looking for my flashlight. Frozen with confusion and fear, I just watched. The other me searched frantically, eventually falling to his hands and knees searching. Words can't express the terror I felt from what I saw next. I watched in the distance as the other me began to physically rip myself apart. I ripped off my own limbs and began eating my fingers. At the sight of this, I began vomiting again, and the stench of burning hair returned. This time, I was only puking bile. I heaved twice before shakily standing up again. Looking back at the peninsula, I saw nothing. The hallucination was gone, but the smell remained. I started running, but the trail I'd hiked hours earlier looked unfamiliar in the dim moonlight. I finally reached a short bridge that I recognized. Reassured that I was on the right path, I charged forward. I sprinted longer than I ever have before, and eventually made it to the blessed parking lot where I immediately threw my stuff into the passenger seat and drove away. I still don't know how to explain what happened to me. I've already consulted my doctor and will see my psychiatrist tomorrow. I'm desperately in need of an explanation. Were these symptoms of an illness or some psychoactive drug? Or did I experience something else entirely? I need to know what the hell happened to me.
Our next story is told by Hannah Robertson about being unwelcome in your own home.
I live in London, and my story takes place back in 2017, when I was still a student. One night, after a long, late class at the university, I walked home, dead tired, just wanting to collapse into bed. The streets were quiet and empty. The occasional flickering streetlight was all that accompanied me as I walked home. As I got closer to my place, I noticed someone slouched in my doorway. A figure huddled up against the door, wrapped in layers of worn-out clothes. As I got nearer, I realized it was a woman, and I figured she was most likely homeless. Her face was hidden beneath a tattered hat, but then she looked up, and our eyes met. Her face was tired, but her eyes were intense. She looked as if she were guarding that spot for dear life. She was tightly gripping a beat-up walking stick. Slowly, she raised it and pointed it directly at me. I froze. Suddenly, she snapped, "Get the fuck out!" Her voice was rough and forceful. The threat felt real. She was clearly ready to use that stick if I took another step. I took a cautious step backward, my mind racing. It was my place, but she seemed so tense and defensive. I tried to think of something to say to calm her down, but before I could even say a word, she lunged forward. She hit my head hard with her stick twice. I turned and rushed back down the street toward the university. After a couple of blocks, I reached the university's security station and practically stumbled in, trying to catch my breath. I told the officer on duty about the woman on my porch and asked if he could come with me. The officer, perhaps a bit perplexed, nodded and agreed to accompany me. When we got back to my place, the porch was empty. She was gone. The officer did a quick look around and shrugged. "Looks like she moved on," he said, giving me a reassuring nod before heading back to the station. I thanked him, relieved, but still on edge. The whole thing had happened so fast, but I felt like I had been holding my breath the entire time. Even though she was gone, I couldn't quite shake my fear. For weeks, every time I came home after dark, I found myself bracing as I got close to my door, half expecting to see her sitting there, eyes glaring up at me. I started leaving the porch light on and checking the lock twice before bed, just in case. I just couldn't forget her face, her fierce, weary look, or the way she guarded my doorway like it was her last refuge. The memory stuck with me. Now and then, I wonder what happened to her. Did she ever think about that night again? Or was I just another imagined aggressor in her mind's eye? I can't imagine how difficult it must be to live on the street. Although the incident frightened me, it remains a stark reminder of how fortunate I am to have a home.
You're listening to Disturbed. We'll be right back.
The last thing you want to hear when you need your auto insurance most is a robot with countless irrelevant menu options. Which is why with USAA Auto Insurance, you'll get great service that is easy and reliable, all at the touch of a button. Get a quote today. Restrictions apply.
Hi, I'm James Wallner, host of the podcast Dakota Spotlight. In 1999, a young man with a bright future was tragically murdered at his workplace in Bismarck, North Dakota. In Homicide at House of Bottles, a new 6-part series, I take you behind the scenes of the investigation with exclusive interviews, original archival audio, and a deep dive into this peculiar crime. Listen to Dakota Spotlight in our newest season anywhere you get your podcasts or at dakotaspotlight.com.
Welcome back to the podcast. This next story comes from Reddit user OK Association 8471 and is narrated by Cesar Brasil. The most horrifying camp with my friends.
It was October 29th, and I was 15 years old. I'd organized a Halloween meetup with my 3 childhood friends at my house, which is pretty isolated, set far away from the city and near some empty farms. It had been a tradition every year to invite my friends over to camp in a tent outside my house, but this time I wanted to add some extra excitement. Instead of camping on my property, I'd chosen a spot further away, about 5 miles from my house. It wasn't an official camping site, just a flat spot in the middle of a field where I'd liked to go chill and clear my thoughts. My friends' names were Ray, Gio, and Adam. Ray was the funny one. Gio was super chill, the kind of friend you could always relax with. And Adam was my very best friend. He and I had hung out almost every day each summer since we were 10 and had been in the same class for 6 straight years. My friends planned to arrive around 2 p.m., and we aimed to head out to our camp area by 4 p.m. Ray and Adam arrived first, and we set up snacks, packed our backpacks, and just joked around like any other 15-year-olds. We planned to get to the camp area using a couple of motorized bicycles and my dirt bike. But then we realized that Adam's bike had a busted clutch cable. We spent a while trying to fix it, but we only made it worse. By the time Gio showed up at 3:30, we decided to adjust our plan. We decided that I'd take Gio on the dirt bike. Adam would ride my other bike and Ray would wait back at my house while I made a return trip to pick him up once we got the others set up at the camp. To get to the camp area, we had to cross a quiet highway, then follow a bumpy, gravelly farm road. By the time Gio and I arrived, it was already getting dark, so I rushed back to get Ray. When we finally all gathered at the spot, Gio and Adam had already set up the firewood but hadn't lit the fire yet. It was pitch black, and somehow the place felt eerie rather than peaceful. We got the fire going and started grilling sausages and enjoying the solitude. Then out of nowhere, we saw a helicopter fly over us. We left nervously, wondering if they'd spotted the fire and if we'd get into trouble for being there. A few minutes later, we saw car headlights off in the distance, maybe a mile away. This was odd, since this area was always empty. No one ever used that old gravel road. The car came to a stop and just sat there with its lights on. After a few moments, it turned them off. We thought it was weird, but didn't give it too much thought. Then we noticed a massive tractor, one of those with crop-cutting blades in front, slowly moving through a field about 200 yards away. We didn't think anything of it at first, but then it started heading directly toward us. We quickly started moving our bikes and bags out of the way, but the tractor kept getting closer, like it had no intention of stopping. At the last second, I grabbed our helmets and moved them just before the tractor rolled over the fire, extinguishing it. Then it stopped. Right there. Turned off its lights and just stood still. It was pitch dark, and we couldn't see inside the cab. We all stood there, creeped out, wondering why it would almost run us over and then just stop. The tractor stayed in place for what felt like an eternity. None of us could see a thing inside, and the thought that someone was just sitting there, silently watching us, gave us chills. After 5 minutes of this, I told everyone we needed to pack up as fast as possible. 2 of my friends somehow squeezed onto the back of my dirt bike, and Adam got onto the motorized bike. We sped off with one of my friends nervously looking back as he clung on. He said the tractor was still just sitting there, in the dark, with its lights off. After a tense, silent ride, We finally made it back home about 20 minutes later. We tried to brush it off, not really talking about it, but the whole experience left us shaken. I can't stop wondering what the driver's intentions were. Why would someone drive so close to us, extinguish our fire, then just sit there in silence? I keep imagining that while we were staring at that dark cab, maybe the driver had already slipped out of the tractor and was silently watching us from behind one of the wheels, hidden in the shadows, just a few steps away. The thought still sends chills down my spine.
Our next story is narrated by Brandon Alexander Smith from r/Let's Not Meet. He lived in my house.
Ever since my family moved into our duplex, there's been this small room in the basement that's always locked. We never use it, and I don't even really know what's in there. I think just utility stuff like meters or something. A couple years ago, my parents went away for a weekend together, leaving me, my older sister, and my baby brother, who was just a few weeks old, at home. My sister and I were old enough to take care of ourselves and the baby, so we weren't concerned about it. That Friday night, my sister went out with friends and wasn't planning to come back home till 4 or 5 in the morning. I put my baby brother to bed in his room upstairs, then settled down in the living room to watch a movie. I ended up dozing off on the couch. A couple hours later, around midnight, I woke up to a strange noise coming from upstairs. At first, I thought it was just the neighbors in the other half of the duplex, since they can be pretty loud and the walls are thin. But then, I looked at the time and realized it was too late for them to still be awake, let alone making that amount of noise. I got up and went to the stairs to investigate, and just as I was about to go up the first step, I heard the sound of something metal falling to the ground. I grabbed my phone and texted my friends about what was happening, too panicked to think of calling the police. Thankfully, one of them did it for me. Suddenly, I heard the bathroom door slam shut. I knew it was the bathroom door because it makes a very specific creaking noise when it closes. I carefully went upstairs to check on my brother to make sure he was okay. Thankfully, he was fine and still asleep in his crib. Not fully grasping how much danger I was in, I went to the bathroom door. Since it opens inward, I decided to forcefully push it open, and I heard a man scream. I immediately shut the door and held it closed to keep him from getting out. I heard glass smashing and concluded he'd broken the bathroom window and climbed out onto the ledge to escape. I rushed to the nursery and picked up my brother, clutching him in my arms. I ran down to the kitchen, and as I was grabbing a knife, I realized that one of the knives was already missing from the knife block. I crouched in the corner of the living room with the baby, crying like never before until the police arrived. When the officers searched the house, they confirmed the bathroom window was broken. On the floor, they found a key, the metal object I'd heard earlier. As it turns out, I'd hit the guy so hard with the bathroom door that there was blood on the tile. But the most shocking part was what they found in that little basement room. There were blankets and cans of food. The police concluded that this man had been living there for several days. The key belonged to that room. We had no idea how the guy got in our house in the first place. Maybe we left one of our doors unlocked by accident? While we went about our daily lives, someone was down there, listening, watching, waiting. From that night on, I always double-check every lock and listen for every creak. And I wonder what might have happened if I hadn't woken up that night.
Our final story comes from Reddit user PracticalSync1484 and is narrated by Dallas Stark, an incredibly creepy family.
This happened several years ago when I was around 18 and living in Nebraska, where I grew up. I lived in Omaha, but it was still essentially surrounded by corn and wheat fields. The city was expanding, so rich folks started building huge houses with giant properties on the edge of town as the city continued to grow. I had a good friend named Jason, whose parents had a big house right on the line between the fields and the city. My friends and I were constantly hanging out at his place because it was so much fun. They had tons of property to ride 4x4s on, a hot tub, and a huge living room for us to watch sports or have reality TV binge sessions. Plus, his parents were super cool and we could drink out there as long as we stayed at the house. The only downside to this house was the seclusion. I am quite scared of the dark, so I would not go outside after a certain time because there was little lighting and his nearest neighbor was about a mile away. The drive out to Jason's house was a long, winding road with thick trees on both sides, and I'd pass one of the city's largest cemeteries on the way. Barely any lighting, of course, besides the street lamps, every once in a while, and very little traffic. It's all inherently a bit creepy, and I'll admit to having sped through this section of road many times to get through it as quickly as possible. I always felt a weird energy driving to and from his place if it was late at night, but nothing ever happened. Until one night. On this particular spring night, the weather was perfect, so I was driving with my windows down listening to music. It was around 10 p.m. I was coming around one of the curves in the road when I suddenly had to slam on my brakes. Picture a completely pitch black road with thick forest on both sides and only my headlights to show what's in front of me. About 50 yards ahead of me, in the middle of the road, was a family. A woman, a man, and a child about 8 years old. The mother was pushing a stroller, and it was fucking empty. They weren't carrying any light source, so before I arrived behind them in my car, they'd been walking in pitch black darkness. They were all facing away from me, walking down the middle of the street in the same direction that I was heading. I turned my music down to hear if they were speaking or playing music, but they weren't. They walked in complete silence. The hairs on my arms stood up. I sat there, waiting for them to move to the side of the road, but they seemed to be completely unfazed by my car's headlights. They didn't turn their heads even slightly, nor did they attempt to move out of my way. I literally thought I was going insane or that I was dreaming. So surreal. Then, before I had time to fully process and register what I was seeing and how truly strange it was, they all, at the same time, stopped walking and very slowly turned to face my car. This scared the absolute shit out of me. I immediately threw my car in reverse and sent it backwards for probably a full 20 seconds before flipping a U-turn, nearly running myself off the road and booking it the other direction. I was so panicked, I'd barely looked at their faces. The part that sticks out in my mind the most was the empty stroller. I've never felt terror like that in my life. I tried asking Jason and his family about what I'd seen, and the way they looked at me made me feel like I was insane. This was, and still is, the creepiest thing to ever happen to me, and I think about it all the time. Was this a distraction for an attempted robbery or assault? Or something even more sinister? I'm glad I didn't wait around to find out.
Want more Disturbed? Check out our Patreon for member-exclusive content, early merch access, and other cool perks. I'm your host, Doug Bailey, and this has been Disturbed, a production of Killer Podcasts and part of the Evergreen Network. For more paranormal and true crime shows, visit killerpodcasts.com. Follow our social channels at Disturbed Podcast on Instagram or Disturbed_pod on Twitter. If you enjoyed the show, please consider subscribing and reviewing on your favorite listening platform. Share your own true horror story at disturbedpodcast.com. Music by Epidemic Sound and by Carl Casey at White Bat Audio. Our producer is Elizabeth Flood. Our sound designer and audio engineer is Nathan Corson. Executive producers Bridget Coyne and Noah Fouts. Until next time, stay safe out there.
Hello, we have this superb podcast called We Didn't Start the Fire, the only podcast started by Billy Joel.
It is the most original, fascinating, and random way to learn the story of the 20th century.
Oh, pretty darned random. And we're joined by some pretty incredible guests.
I only wrote stuff that I wanted to hear. If it turned out to be a hit, it was pure dumb luck.
With me, Katie Puckrick.
And me, Tom Fordyce.
This is We Didn't Start the Fire, the only podcast started by me, Billy Joel.